Elliot lived alone on the edge of a small town, in a house that once belonged to his grandmother. It was an old wooden structure with creaky floors and thin walls that held on to the sounds of life long after they'd passed. Each morning, he followed the same quiet routine: coffee, brewed just before dawn, a short walk down the wooded path behind the house, and hours spent at his desk transcribing old court records for the county archive. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid steadily, and he preferred the company of dead voices to the noise of the living. There was comfort in repetition. The kitchen clock ticked in sync with the blinking cursor on his screen. Birds outside tapped at the window sometimes, looking for crumbs. The same neighborhood cat, a calico with a torn ear, slept on his porch chair every afternoon. His life was a still frame, unchanged and undisturbed. And he liked it that way. The townspeople barely knew him, and that suited Elliot fine. He had no family left, no social obligations. His phone hardly rang. On weekends, he would visit the local flea market for records and rare books, making polite conversation with vendors who always forgot his name. Evenings were spent reading under a low lamp, the sound of the forest through the windows his only companion. He had few visitors. Once every few months, someone from the archive would drop off boxes of documents. They never stayed long. No one ever did. His house had a reputation for feeling too quiet, though no one could explain why. Elliot thought it was just superstition. The quiet was the point. Though his days were full of silence, he never felt lonely. In fact, he preferred it. Silence was clean, predictable. Nothing unexpected ever happened in silence. But sometimes, when he turned in for the night, Elliot would find himself pausing at the top of the stairs, heart slowing, as though listening for something he hadn't consciously noticed. Then, dismissing the moment, he'd go to bed. There was nothing strange about his life. No missing time, no unexplained drafts, no dreams that lingered in the morning. Just the steady rhythm of a life lived alone, by choice, but quiet, left too long. As a way of collecting echoes, and Elliot was starting to feel that something was listening back. It began with a sound, barely noticeable at first. Elliot was working late one evening, scrolling through digitized case files, when he heard what he assumed was the wind brushing against the eaves. It came softly, almost tender, like fingertips, along the siding. He paused, listened, but the noise didn't repeat. Shrugging it off, he returned to his work. Old wood creaked. It always had. The next night, the sound returned, but different, sharper, more deliberate. A light tap, tap, tap near the window behind him. He turned quickly, expecting to see a bird or branch, but the pane was bare. No wind, no rain. Just stillness. He stayed frozen for a few seconds, eyes scanning the dark glass, then stood and pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. Tension lingered in the room after he sat back down. He couldn't focus, his thoughts flickering back to the tapping. Still, he told himself, houses made noise. Wood expanded and contracted. It was probably the house settling, or maybe a squirrel. But then it happened again. 3 nights later, same hour, same spot. Tap, 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 like knuckles on glass. That time, he didn't move. He didn't even breathe. He waited, muscles tight, expecting another knock. But it stopped at 3. Just enough to make sure he noticed. In the morning, he checked. Outside, nothing was amiss. No tracks in the dew. No tree branches near the window. The glass was clean and touched. He mentioned it in passing to the clerk at the flea market, masking his concern behind humor. "Maybe my house wants attention," he joked. The woman laughed politely, but didn't comment. He felt foolish for bringing it up, yet the tension didn't fade. It grew. He began noticing small changes. A drawer slightly ajar. A book off-center on the shelf. The kitchen chair not quite tucked in. Things he might have done without thinking, but he couldn't remember doing them. He told himself it was nothing. But the awareness settled deeper, a growing itch behind his ribs. One night, he found the cellar door unlocked. He always kept it bolted always. He stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness below, waiting for some instinct to tell him what to do. The air was stale, but not musty. Something colder, emptier, He closed the door quietly, bolted it, and leaned his weight against it for a moment longer than he needed to. Still silence, but no longer comforting. Something had shifted, and he wasn't alone in his house anymore. Elliot tried to return to his routine, but the silence he once cherished now felt like a presence, waiting for him to speak. Each creak in the floorboards made his shoulders tense. Each flicker in the corner of his vision left him holding his breath a beat too long. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks, too much isolation. Too much late-night reading, but the lie didn't sit comfortably. One morning, he woke to find his slippers turned inward, at the foot of the bed, perfectly aligned. He never placed them that way. He'd always kicked them off before pulling the covers over his legs, letting them lie where they fell. It was a small thing, a stupid thing, but it felt invasive, like someone had tidied them for him. Later that day, he was sorting through old transcripts when he noticed a file on his screen he didn't remember opening. A deposition from 1984. He stared at it, trying to recall if he'd clicked something by accident. The cursor blinked beside a sentence that had no right to chill. But she said she heard someone in the house, even though she lived alone. It was coincidence, of course. Random. But still, Elliot closed the file and shut the laptop more forcefully than necessary. He didn't finish work that day. By the end of the week, he had started double-locking doors and leaving lights on in empty rooms. He began placing small objects, coins, a pencil, his wristwatch, specific surfaces in deliberate positions, taking pictures to compare later. When they moved, even by an inch, he felt it like a jolt in his chest. He tried to talk himself down. "You're just unraveling," he whispered aloud one night, standing alone in the bathroom, staring at his reflection. But his eyes didn't look like his own anymore. They looked too tired, too wary. Then came the footsteps, soft, careful, almost curious. Not every night, but often enough. Always from the hallway. Always when he was in bed, lights off, heart pounding. He never got up to check. He just lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, hands clutching the blanket, listening. Sometimes it would stop. Sometimes it wouldn't. One night, as he stared at the ceiling, he whispered into the dark, "What do you want?" He hadn't meant to say it, but something in the silence after felt ... attentive, as though whatever it was had been waiting for him to ask. It happened on a Thursday. Elliot had spent the day trying to convince himself things were fine. He had even called an old friend for the first time in months. Laughed hollowly into the phone, forced a version of himself into the conversation, but the house didn't let him pretend for long. That night, he fell asleep with the hallway light on. It gave him a false sense of comfort, a dim glow seeping beneath the bedroom door. He'd taken to sleeping with one hand clutching the flashlight, the other resting on his chest, as if to feel each beat proof he was still there. Around 3:12 a.m., he woke up, not from a sound. Not exactly from the absence of it. The hallway light gone. Blinked, trying to adjust his vision to the sudden blackness, then sat up slowly. The silence wasn't peaceful. It pressed against his skin, thick, heavy. Listening then, from the foot of the bed came a whisper. Not words, not breath, just a sound. A presence brushing past the edge of hearing. He froze, unable to move, every nerve waiting for confirmation, something. Anything. And then the bedsheets tugged, gently, deliberately. He shot upright, heart hammering against his ribs. "Who's there?" His voice cracked mid-whisper. He reached for the flashlight and clicked it on. Nothing. But the sheet was still pulled tight and unnatural on the right side, as if something had gripped it a moment before. He didn't sleep. The rest of the night, in the morning, the hallway light bulb was shattered on the floor. No sign of how, no reason it should have fallen, but it had. He swept it up in silence, the broom bristling like static against the tile. He called an electrician, claimed the wiring needed checking. When the man came, he inspected the fixtures, shook his head, and said, "Everything's fine." Elliot nodded, thanked him, and paid in cash, but he didn't believe it. Later that evening, as Elliot checked the objects he'd carefully arranged on the table, a ring of keys, a pocket knife, a torn envelope, he noticed something new. A small smudge on the mirror above the fireplace. It was shaped like a fingerprint, too high for him to have touched. too clear to ignore. He pressed his own finger beside it. The size didn't match. That night, the cellar door stood open. He didn't remember unbolting it. Didn't remember hearing it move. But it was open wide, yawning, black, and silent. And something was waiting just beyond the last stair. Elliot didn't sleep after that. He tried, curling beneath blankets with the flashlight clutched in his palm until morning bled into the room through the curtains. But his thoughts never slowed. They circled like wolves around the open cellar door, gnawing at the last threads of logic. He told himself not to go down there. But curiosity, that ancient pull, wrapped itself around his spine. He waited until mid-morning, when the sun felt strongest, when reality seemed most grounded, and then stood at the top of the cellar stairs. The door creaked louder than he remembered. The air inside was colder than it should have been. Each step downward echoed like it was calling back to something hidden. The cellar hadn't changed. Cement floor, exposed pipes, dust-coated shelves. But there was a smell, now a faint sourness beneath the usual mildew, like something organic trying not to be found. He scanned the room with the flashlight, heart, THUDDING, dot near the back wall, behind an old tool chest, was a crawl space. He'd forgotten about it. Or maybe he hadn't. Maybe he'd just never wanted to remember. He stared into the opening, barely large enough to fit a body. A draft moved through it slow, deliberate, like breath. He didn't go in, not that day. But he didn't close the cellar door, either. In the days that followed, things unraveled faster. He began to forget simple tasks, where he left his keys, whether he'd locked the front door, if he'd eaten. Sounds came at random, tapping in the walls, a soft sigh behind him in the mirror, the whir of the typewriter, even when it wasn't plugged in. He stopped calling friends. He barely touched food. His skin looked paler, thinner, like the house was slowly draining the color from him. Then came the photographs. They arrived in an unmarked envelope on the kitchen counter. He never heard the door, never heard a knock. But the envelope was there, warm like it had just been touched. Inside were 3 pictures. One of his bedroom taken from outside the window, one of him asleep in bed, and one of the crawlspace door. Open. He dropped them like they burned him. Later, he found the same photos in the bathroom. Then again, in the fridge. Someone or something was showing him, telling him, "I've been here. I've always been here." And at night, the tapping turned to scratching. Long, slow, rhythmic, coming from beneath the floorboards. The cellar door stayed open, and the breath from the crawlspace grew louder. Elliot knew it would end in the cellar. Everything pointed there, the sounds, the photographs, the feeling of being watched from beneath the floor. It was no longer about fear. It was about inevitability. Something was waiting, and he couldn't keep pretending it wasn't real. He waited until midnight, not because he wanted to be dramatic, but because that's when the sounds were loudest, the air thickest, and the presence strongest. He took the flashlight, the old pocket knife, and a candle. Not for light, but for something to hold on to, something fragile, human. The cellar steps creaked under his weight, each footfall swallowed by the dark. The air was still damp, that same sour note lingering. But tonight, it was stronger rancid, alive. He moved slowly, careful not to make a sound louder than the pulse in his ears. The crawlspace was open, wide now, wider than before. Too wide the edges of it seemed to breathe, like lungs beneath the earth, exhaling damp air that brushed against his cheeks. He crouched near it, the candle flickering violently, as if it, too, was afraid. The flashlight caught something inside. Something metallic. He reached in. His fingers brushed cold steel. A typewriter, his typewriter, the one that had vanished from his desk. 2 nights ago, it was sitting inside the crawlspace, clean, untouched, except for a single page curled in the ribbon. His name was typed at the top. Beneath it, a paragraph. It was a description of this moment, of him crouching, candle flickering, reading. He dropped the page. The sound echoed, behind him footsteps. He turned sharply, light flailing across the basement. While nothing but the footsteps didn't stop. They moved slowly, deliberately, circling him, though the floor was empty. He called out. His voice was hollow. The candle snuffed itself, without warning. Only the flashlight remained, flickering weakly, like its batteries were rotting inside. Then the typewriter began to type, by itself. Keys, slamming, deliberate, and slow, like a heartbeat. One word at a time. He stepped back, heart clawing its way up his throat. The words spelled out, "You brought this." The flashlight went out. Total black. He felt breath near his ear, not warm, not human, and then he understood. The house wasn't haunted, it was writing, using him, feeding on him. He wasn't the author, he was the story. The next morning, the house was silent again. No more scratching, no sounds from the walls, no flickering lights. Just a stillness that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something holding its breath. Elliot wasn't in bed. His shoes were by the door. His coat was missing. But no one saw him leave. The typewriter sat alone on the kitchen table. A fresh page loaded, clean, empty, waiting his neighbor. Mrs. Cartwright came by to return a ladder and noticed the front door slightly ajar. She called his name, peeked inside. Everything looked in order, except the air was unusually cold, and she swore the walls felt like they were listening. The police came later that day. A missing persons report was filed. They searched the house. Nothing was stolen, no signs of forced entry or struggle. But something made them uneasy, especially the basement. One officer described it as wrongly quiet. Another refused to go down altogether. They found the crawl space. They found the typewriter. They found the page. It was filled, single-spaced, neatly typed. No name at the top, but it told a story. A man named Elliot, a writer, a house, a cellar, a presence. It described everything that happened over the past 7 days, in detail. Even the thoughts Elliot never voiced. Even the final moment. When the flashlight died, and the breath curled against his skin, the last line read, he understood. Now he wasn't writing the story. He was the story. And then it stopped. No period, just space. One officer took the page home. That night, he dreamed of being buried alive in wet soil. He said he could hear typing, even in the dream. When he awoke, the dream was gone, but the sound remained. Clicking, faint but steady, from the hallway. His wife never heard it. But every night since, it returned, tap, tap, tap. Another page appeared in the typewriter, 2 days later. New words, a new name, not Elliot, another man, another home. The story was beginning again. Neighbors say the house still looks lived in. Lights turn on at night. Shadows move behind curtains. But no one lives there. The mailbox is always empty. Only the typewriter remains. And it writes. Always writes. No one knows where Elliot went, or if he even existed at all. But those who read the pages never forget them. Because the story doesn't want to be forgotten. It wants to be read, and once you've read it, it remembers you too.